Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first invited lecture of the Southeast European SDEWES Conference in Sarajevo. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Amela Ajanovic. I have known her for many years. She attended one of our special sessions many years ago at the 80th birthday of Professor Ivo Schlaus. Professor Ajanovic is professor at Technical University Vienna. She is also faculty member of postgraduate master program Renewable Energy Systems, and she has been guest researcher at the Energy Research Center of the Netherlands in Amsterdam and the International Energy Agency in Paris, as well as Technical University in Prague. She has been involved in many international research projects, and today we are looking forward to hearing from her how COVID-19 could change the transportation systems. Please, Professor Ajanovic, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will open my... So, just a moment. So, good morning. It's my great pleasure to be here, at least that we have this SDEWES conference in this way. In my presentation, I will discuss the impact of coronavirus on the transport system. In my presentation, I will start with a brief introduction, then I will discuss...
Excuse me, I just have to interrupt you for a moment. I have to tell everybody that the presentation will be live also on YouTube, so that this is a live recording which can also be followed by YouTube. And now please continue, Professor Ajanovic, with your presentation. Thank you.
So in my presentation, I will start with a brief introduction. I will discuss current development in the transport sector that we have. I will talk about recent developments and challenges that we are facing. The fact is that we have a car-oriented mobility, that we have urbanization trend, as well as increasing congestions in the most of the urban areas. Then I will discuss the impact of coronavirus on mobility, what can we recognize already now, and what could be the long-term impact. And finally, I will close my presentation with the major conclusions. Our transport system is changing all the time. For the long time of the history, our transport system was based on non-commercial renewable energy. We have used horses and sailing ships for mobilities. At that time, the total amount of transport service per capita was very low. However, with the Industrial Revolution, with the new inventions such as steam machines, steam railways, electricity combustion engine, it was possible to use also other energy carriers for mobility, especially fossil energy, at least coal, oil, as well as natural gas. And over the last 100 years, the total amount of transport service per capita has rapidly increased. This very fast development that we have had over the last years has some advantages. We can nowadays very easily move from one point to another, but also has led to some additional problems. What we are facing today are congestions, increasing local air pollutions, global greenhouse gas emissions, very high noise level, especially in urban areas. And the transport system that we currently have is not sustainable. We have to change this system. Our transport sector is currently almost completely based on oil products, especially gasoline and diesel. This is least diversified energy sector, and in the most of countries and regions, we have very high energy import dependency, especially from the Middle East countries. Using fossil fuels in a transport sector caused continuously increasing greenhouse gas emissions. In this figure, you can see development of greenhouse gas emissions by sectors in EU28 since 2019. What we can recognize here, that in the most of the energy sectors, we have stable, even decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. The only opposite situation we have in the transport sector. In the transport sector, total emissions have been continuously increasing until 2007. After that, due to the financial crisis, we can notice slight decrease, but over the last few years, we have again this increasing trend. And this is something what had to be changed. In Europe, transport sector is responsible for about 1/4 of the total greenhouse gas emissions. Largest amount of these emissions in the transport sector are caused by road transport, about 73%. And in the road transport, the largest contributor to these emissions are passenger cars with a share of about 61%. So it's a huge need to find effective policies and measures which can be implemented on the passenger cars and can lead to the reduction of the total greenhouse gas emissions. In Europe, we have already a broad portfolio of policies which are implemented, as well as we have set targets for the future. What we currently have are, for example, targets for the reduction of CO2 emissions from the new passenger cars. The last target was 130 grams CO2 per kilometer driven, and this was reached in 2050. And the next target that we have is 95 grams CO2 per kilometer driven, which have to be reached next years. Already now we have set goals, more ambitious goals for 2025 and 2030. To reach this ambitious goal, it's important to improve energy efficiency of conventional cars, but also to increase the use of more energy efficient automotive technologies, such as electric vehicles. We have also in Europe climate and energy packages for 2020 as well as for 2030. And according to these packages, the goal is to have further reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, to have increasing use of renewable energy sources in electricity generation, as well as to have increase in energy efficiency. In addition, there are the goals for the transport sector. The goal is to have at least 10% share of renewable energy in the transport, energy consumption in the transport sector in 2020, and about 14% in 2030. In addition, we have a transport white paper. According to this document, the goal is to have further emission reductions in 2030 and 2050, as well as to remove conventional internal combustion engine vehicles from urban areas. The final goal is to have urban areas, cities, completely without internal combustion engine vehicles. And actually this ban of internal combustion engine vehicles has already started. Many cities worldwide have announced, already introduced zero emission zones or low carbon emission zones. And for example, Norway has set a target to stop the registration of conventional cars starting from 2025. Some other countries, for example, Denmark, Ireland, Iceland, Netherlands, and Slovenia will have this target starting from 2030. So basically, internal combustion engine vehicles have to be removed from our streets, and they will be, to some extent, replaced with other transport modes, for example, public transport, walking, cycling, but also they will be, to some extent, replaced with so-called zero-emission vehicles, such as battery electric vehicles. Electric vehicles have been recognized as technology which can help us to reduce some of the problems in the transport sector that we currently have. Also in the scope of Paris Declaration on Electromobility and Climate Change and Call to Action is set a goal to have more than 100 million electric vehicles and about 400 million 2- and 3-wheelers by 2030. And this is actually an ambitious target when we know that we currently have about 7.2 million electric vehicles worldwide. So in the scope of 100 years, we have, or of 10 years, we have to move from 7 million to 100 million electric vehicles. But the fact is that the number of electric vehicles is continuously increasing starting from about 2010. As you can see here, all over the world, we have increasing number. However, when we are looking at the total number of electric vehicles, we can notice that this number is still very, very low comparing to the total vehicle stock that we have. Currently, the largest electric vehicle market is China with a share of about 45%, followed by Europe with a share of 24%, and United States with a share of 22%. In Europe, the largest number of electric vehicles is in Norway, France, Finland, Netherlands, actually with the countries, Germany with the countries with higher GDP. Electric vehicles, as every technology that we have, has some advantages and disadvantages. The most important advantages of electric vehicles is high energy efficiency. Energy efficiency of electric vehicles is about 70%, much higher than energy efficiency of conventional cars, which is about 25%. Then electric vehicles can help us to increase energy supply security. As I showed before, our transport system is currently completely dependent on oil imports from Middle East countries. And with higher use of electric vehicles, we can increase energy supply security. Electricity needed for electric cars can be produced in every country using all available primary energy sources. Then electric vehicles are also, battery electric vehicles are also zero emission vehicles. That means they have zero emissions at the point of use, and they can help us to improve local air quality, what is especially important for urban areas with high population density. Also, they can help us to reduce noise level in urban areas. In the case that for electricity production, we are using renewable energy sources, then electric vehicles can also contribute to the reduction of the total greenhouse gas emissions. However, besides these advantages that we have, there are also some disadvantages. The most important are the cost. Electric vehicles are currently not economically competitive without additional supporting measures. To make electric vehicles more competitive and more attractive for users, many governments worldwide have provided different kinds of supporting policy measures. These supporting policy measures could be divided in two categories: monetary and non-monetary measures. The most important monetary measures are subsidies, or for example, tax reductions or exemptions. But also there are non-monetary measures, such as, for example, possibility for electric vehicles drivers to use bus lanes, to enter zero emission zones, to have free parking spaces. And all this should make electric vehicles more attractive and more competitive with conventional cars. The other disadvantage of electric vehicles is a shorter driving range. The driving range of electric vehicles could be increased with a larger battery. If we have battery with higher capacity, we could have longer driving range, but this increase in the battery capacity has also increased in the cost of electric vehicles as well as in the weight. So basically currently this range is limited, but mostly for the use in urban areas should not be the problem. The other disadvantage is the charging time. The charging time of electric vehicles could be between few minutes and few hours. And this could be especially challenging when we are traveling outside of the cities. And also the charging infrastructure is mostly provided in urban areas. So this driving range is seen as disadvantage, but currently most of electric vehicles are used in urban areas, and the daily mobility need in urban areas is usually between 10 and 40 kilometers per day, and this can be covered with every type of electric vehicles. For example, here you can see that daily mobility need in Amsterdam, it's about 10 kilometers, in Vienna 35, Stockholm 40, Shanghai 40. So it can be covered with every type of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are especially of interest for the use in urban areas, while they can help us to reduce local air pollution as well as to reduce noise level. What we can recognize over the last decades is that we have continuously increasing number of population living in urban areas. We have an urbanization trend, and this will be continued also in the future. We can expect that in 2050, only 1/3 of the total population will be living in rural areas. So it will be very challenging to provide mobility as well as other energy services to all this population in urban areas. Already now we have some cities with very high population density. We are talking about mega cities, and it's really challenging to improve air quality in such cities as well as to provide mobility. The problem that we currently have is the fact that we have car-oriented mobility. The vehicle stock, the number of vehicles, is continuously increasing all over the world. Due to the increased number of cars, we have increasing congestions. To reduce congestions, we are making investments in the new roads, and in the short term, the additional roads can help us to reduce congestions, but in the long term, more roads means again more cars again more congestions, more roads, and we have a car-oriented mobility cycle. And this is something would have to be changed. As a result of such cycle, we have a huge roads with a lot of powerful cars on it, but the average speed in this case about 20 kilometers per hour. And this is very inefficient, very expensive, and very time-intensive mobility. Another important issue is to recognize that in cities we have very limited space which can be used for mobility, and there is a huge difference between area occupied by cars, bicycles, as well as public transport. So the problems that we currently have in the transport sector have been already recognized, and many policymakers and governments have already started transition toward more sustainable mobility. They are usually applying avoid, shift, improve strategy. Avoid means that we need to avoid unnecessary travel and reduce trip distances. And this is also very dependent on the city structure, urban planning, spatial planning. Then it's important to make a shift from the car-oriented mobility towards more sustainable transport modes. It's important to have possibility for safe walking, cycling, as well as to have a safe and affordable public transport. And it's also important to improve transport practices, to have, for example, car sharing, bike sharing, as well as to increase the efficiency of the vehicles that we are using, to increase the use of zero-emission vehicles, more energy-efficient vehicles such as electric vehicles. As I said before, in Europe, we have very broad portfolio of policies which are already implemented. To see what can be the impact of such policies and measures, we can create different scenarios. When we are creating scenarios, we have usually a business as usual scenario, which should show us what can happen in the future without any additional policies, measures, without significant changes. And when we are talking about mobility, we should avoid these business as usual scenarios. And we can create different kind of policy scenarios to see what can be impact of different measures. For example, higher CO2 taxes, higher number of electric vehicles, and so on. Basically, up to 2030, 2050, there is a already broad portfolio of scenarios showing us what could be a possible development. But in none of these scenarios, we have calculated with the impact of coronavirus. The emergency of coronavirus was identified already at the end of December 2019, and already on 11th March 2020, global pandemic was declared by World Health Organization. Already by the end of April, we have had worldwide about 3 million COVID cases and over 200,000 deaths in almost 200 countries. About 55% of the global population, representing 60% of global GDP, was subject to partial or total lockdowns. Many countries have imposed restrictions on most social and economic activities with the goal to the spread of coronavirus. And finally, this has triggered a macroeconomic shock. The stop of economic activities due to the lockdown has a huge impact on GDP. The total impact on GDP from this crisis is still unknown. It's very dependent on the duration of the lockdowns as well as the shape of the recovery. The shape of the recovery can be affected by the, for example, second wave of the infection. And it's also dependent on the size and the design of macroeconomic policy responses. In the best case, some economic activities affected by the lockdown will be just postponed for the later, but in some sectors like tourism, the crisis could have a long-term impact. Actually, when we are looking at this figure, we can notice that every crisis until now have had the impact on the GDP, Second World War, oil crisis, financial crisis. However, for now, it's very difficult to see what will be the full impact of this crisis. We are still in the crisis. GDP has a huge impact on the mobility. We can notice from the statistical data is the clear correlation between GDP and car ownership level as well as travel activity. If we have more money, we are investing more money for mobility. For example, in this figure, you can see the new passenger car registrations in the EU as well as development of the GDP. Due to the crisis financial crisis in period 2007-2009, we can notice significant decrease in the GDP. And this decrease in GDP had also impact on the new cars registrations. When we're looking at this figure, it was necessary about 10 years to have the same level of the new cars registrations. It was necessary 10 years as before to have the same level of registration as before the crisis. This crisis has also impact on the energy demand. What can be already noticed now at the beginning of the crisis is that already in the first quarter of this year, we have had decrease in the global energy demand by 3.8% comparing to the first quarter of the last years. According to the International Energy Agency, by the end of this year, we can count to have one drop in energy demand of about 6%. And this drop is calculated without the second wave of infection. In the case of the second wave of the infection, this decrease could be even higher. And actually, this decline in energy demand has not been seen for the last 70 years, actually since the Second World War. Especially affected in this crisis is the transport sector. We have restricted mobility, and oil demand. Oil is actually about 60% of oil is used in the transport sector. So we can count that oil demand will drop by the end of this year by 9%. And that means that the oil demand in this year will be at the same level in 2000 as in 2012. We can also notice a reduce in demand for coal gas, but what is interesting to see that we can count with a slight increase of renewable energy sources, but just about 1% due to the low operating cost. However, we cannot count with the increasing use of biofuels. Already in this first quarter, actually the period February-April, we can notice that in United States, we have had reduction of biofuels production of about 50%. Due to the lockdown, also some biofuels production plants have stopped operation. And since biofuels have to be blended with gasoline and diesel, reduce oil demand lead also to reduce demand for biofuels. Actually, this crisis has affected every areas of our life, but especially mobility and our freedom to move from one point to another. We can already now recognize some new developments, some significant changes. What we can recognize is that this crisis has a huge impact on auto industry, especially on electric vehicles. Then we can notice also significant change in modal split. Unfortunately, we can notice that we have shift from public transport to private cars, as well as what is positive, increasing use of walking and cycling. Then we are also developing new working and living habits. We have increasing use of teleworking, video conferences. We are purchasing different items online. All this has impact also on the total mobility demand. And at least in the short term, we can recognize some environmental benefits due to the reduced economic activities as well as reduced mobility. We have reduced emissions and local air pollutions. Basically, the global car market is very sensitive to macroeconomic conditions. With the first outspread of the coronavirus in Asia, auto sales declined significantly, as you can see in this figure. Already in the first 2 months of this year, January and February, decline in car sales in China was 44%, in Korea 18%, in Japan about 11%. Korea and China were two countries mostly affected by this crisis. Also, there are some forecasts that automotive sales in Europe will also drop by 14% by the end of this year, comparing to the 2019. Here you can see the passenger cars registration in the EU over the last 5 months from January to May. In average, we can notice that the total number of new cars registration has dropped in this 5 months for 41.5%. However, decrease is different from month to month. In opposite to China and Korea, they have largest decrease in the car sales in the first 2 months, January, February. In Europe, the largest decrease was in April, about 76%. Also, this decrease is different from country to country. The highest was in Spain, Italy, and France, actually in the countries mostly affected by this virus. What is important to recognize here is that we have increasing unemployment, and due to this current situation, decreasing GDP, we can also count that the number of new cars in the next years will be also reduced, actually in the next at least 5 years. And this, on the one side, will have dramatic loss of revenues for auto industry, but also this means that the average age of vehicles will be higher than nowadays. Currently in Europe, the average age of cars is about 11 years, and in the future, the drop in car sales will slow the improvement of energy efficiency of vehicles that we are using. Especially high impact of this crisis could impact electric vehicles, at least in the short term. As I discussed before, electric vehicles are currently not economically competitive with conventional cars due to higher investment costs, as well as due to the shorter driving range. To make electric vehicles more competitive, we need different kinds of supporting measures. However, what we can notice now is that we have very low oil prices, and this decrease in oil prices make this competition of electric vehicles with conventional cars even harder. Cheap oil price extends significantly the payback time of the price premium for electric vehicles. In addition, due to current poor economic situation, it's very likely that subsidies from the public will be at least limited in the future. Also, in the current situation, consumers may more hesitate to adopt new and more expensive technologies such as electric vehicles. What we can recognize already from China is that we have a significant decrease in electric vehicle sales. Already in January, the sales of electric vehicles dropped by 54%, and in February, this was decreased by 19%. It is maybe important to say that China is not just the largest electric vehicle market. China is also leader in battery production. Worldwide, the car industry is very dependent from the China battery manufacturing as well as supplies of different components. So every delay in battery production in China have impact on electric vehicle production also outside of China. And in the future, it will be important to reconsider this globalized electric vehicle supply chain, and maybe to change towards shorter and localized energy supply chains. In this way, we can reduce the risk of supply disruptions, as well as we can reduce total carbon footprint of electric vehicles. Currently, electric vehicles are mostly used in urban areas. However, due to the limited travel possibility with public transport, especially airplanes, cars should be able to cover also long travel distances. Since electric vehicles have a shorter driving range and longer charging time, diesel and gasoline vehicles could be more preferable choice in current situation. Also, in urban areas, we have a lot of electric vehicles used for car sharing, but due to the possibility of infection spread, every type of sharing is currently pretty unattractive. It is interesting to recognize that we have a shift in the modal split. For the majority of consumers in the past, travel time and comfort was the high priority when we are talking about mobility. However, with this crisis, this crisis could bring us fundamental change in our mobility preferences. The safety of mobility is becoming most important factor when we are making a decision how and when to travel from one point to another. In this figure, we can see the lesson learned from China. On the left side of this figure, we have situation before modal split in China before the outbreak of coronavirus. And on the right side, we have situation after the outbreak of coronavirus. So what we can recognize in this figure is that in China, we have very significant shift from public transport towards private cars. Before the crisis, the share of public transport was 56%, and after the crisis, actually now during the crisis, 24%. And the use of private cars before the crisis was 34%, and currently is 66%. Due to the risk of infections, also interest in shared mobility, also this macro mobility is less attractive, but the fact is that the sale of personal macro mobility, for example, e-scooters, e-bikes, is increasing during this crisis. Many cities have already, before this crisis, started investment in cycling and walking. They have seen this possibility to reduce mobility with cycling and walking. However, during this pandemic, this trend has been actually intensified. As access to public transit system was limited, many cities have allowed bikers and pedestrians to use roads to cope with social distancing requirements. So we have a lot of temporary bike lines during this crisis in the most of the cities. Many cities are also increasing the number of zero emission zones. An interesting example is Milan. Milan is the city, very polluted city and very affected by this pandemic. And they have recently announced plans to permanently convert 35 kilometers of street to cycling and walking. Actually, this crisis had showed that cycling and walking was the best way to get around for many essential tasks. And walking and cycling are not just resilient, they are also affordable for everyone. As I talked before, we have currently the car-oriented mobility. We have very high congestions in the most of the cities. And our road infrastructures is designed around two peaks, one in the morning and one in the evening. With travel reduction, we could reduce peak demand and avoid investments in expensive new roads. And we could also reduce parking spaces. This crisis has showed that people whose work requires a computer and internet connection don't need to go to the office every day. Due to the home working, a large number of cities are experiencing reduced or no congestion. In this figure, you can see the traffic in Brussels in 1 week in last years before this shift in our working towards home working, as well as in 1 week in April. In Belgium, some of the people, about 23% of employees, have used sometimes home working, or have sometimes work from home, about 23% of the Belgian employees. But during this crisis, this number has increased on 50%. What we can recognize in this figure is that before the crisis, we have had two clear peaks in the morning and afternoon from Monday till Friday. Due to the lockdowns, reduced travel activity, we can notice that we have reduced traffic, but also we can notice that we don't have these peaks in the morning and evening. And this experience of homework is something what can be used also after this crisis to help us to reduce congestions in the cities. I have already before discussed that we currently have reduced energy demand, especially demand for fossil energy, for oil products, coal, gas. This reduced energy demand has, of course, impact on the emissions. But what we can learn from the previous crisis is that this reduction in emission was always just in the short term, followed by the post-crisis rebound. For example, during the financial crisis, we have had a reduction of CO2 emissions of 1.4% in 2009. However, already in 2010, there was significant growth of 5.1%, what is well above the long-term average. It's important to recognize that only crises driven by economic factors, such as oil crisis in 1970s and 1980s have led to substantial improvement of energy efficiency as well as a substantial increase of alternative energy sources. So this rebound, post-crisis rebound, was avoided. What will be the full impact of this crisis is still unknown, since we don't know what will be the part of the recovery. What we can recognize currently is that we at least have some short-term improvement in the air quality and emission reduction. However, it's important to know that according to the World Health Organization, we have every year about 3 million deaths due to the air pollution. More than 80% of population living in urban areas are exposed to air quality level that extend safety limits. So we have, due to the air pollution, 3 million deaths every year. And due to this coronavirus, until now, we have less than 500,000. So it's very important to think how to change, how to improve the air quality in cities. Due to the stopped or reduced industrial activity as well as mobility, we can notice significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. And this is the only benefit of this crisis. For example, in the January and February this year, the level of nitrogen dioxide in Asia was by 40% lower comparing to the same period of 2019. And nitrogen dioxide is mostly caused by road transport and power plants, and it can cause respiratory illness as well as coronavirus. China emits over 50% of the nitrogen dioxide in Asia. So to reduce these air pollutions that we currently have, very dangerous air pollution that we have, it's very important to shift towards zero emission vehicles, to increase the use of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles have zero emissions at the point of view, so they can help us to solve this, to some extent, to solve this, to reduce this emission in urban areas. But it's important to recognize that this emission, this pollution is also caused by power plants. So to have full environmental benefits of electric vehicles, it's very important to use renewable energy for electricity generation. Only this combination of renewable green electricity and zero emission vehicles can help us reduce significantly local emission or local pollution as well as global greenhouse gas emissions. And in this figure, you can see concentration of nitrogen dioxide in China in January, before the full effect of the lockdowns, as well as in February. So we can notice that we have huge difference. And this is something what is important to have in the future, much less pollution in urban areas. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I'm coming to the conclusions. What is important to stress is that we are still in this corona crisis, is still, we have still very high uncertainties regarding the long-term impacts of this crisis. But the fact is that we already now have significantly reduced transport demand. We have significant change in our lifestyle. We have increased home working, we have video conferences, we have significantly reduced international and intercontinental travel. The most of our population in the most of the countries is still not ready to make long trips, especially using airplanes. For the future, to reduce the environmental problems that we have, to reduce air pollution in urban areas, as well as to reduce global greenhouse gas emission caused by transport sector, it will be very important to increase the use of electric vehicles. However, due to the relatively poor economic situation, it could happen that the investment in this technology will be slowed down, at least in the short term. This current reduction of emissions that we can recognize will be just in the short term. To allow to have long-term impact, it's very important to have appropriate policy framework which can ensure also the long-term impact of emission reductions. This crisis is challenging, but this crisis can be also seen as an opportunity to rethink our transport system and to recognize how important it is to have low pollutions in cities to avoid illnesses caused due to the transport system. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for a very nice presentation. It is now time for questions. So we actually have two possibilities for asking questions. One is that we do it now. You can raise your hand. The attendees have this right. And there is also a possibility to write your question in Q&A. For the beginning, I would like to ask you a question. How do you take into account the increasing amount of distance work? For example, we had like 2 months when we never went to the office, so everything was done on distance. How does this affect the demand on transport?
Well, this, as I showed before, it's a huge impact because we have significantly reduced travel demand, and this was the huge advantage of this crisis, and this was the reason that we have reduced emissions and air pollutions. This has helped us also that we have reduced, through this reduced work and office, we have reduced also congestions in the most of the cities. And this has allowed us to have much easier delivery of other goods which was necessary during this crisis. So this is something what can be a positive experience from this crisis and what can be also continued in the future. For most of us, it would be possible also in the future to work at least few days in the week from home. And with this could reduce this peak demand for mobility. This can avoid investment in the new roads as well as can reduce the amount of space for parkings that we currently have very limited in urban areas. So this is something I think that will continue in the future. For example, at our university, we are already now considering possibility in the future to at least few days work from home. So this, I think the many also employees as well as many companies have recognized some advantages of these flexible working patterns.
Thank you very much for your explanation. Let's hope that these patterns actually stay and that there are also ways how to strengthen them and improve them, because this would obviously reduce the demand on transport a lot. I believe Neven has a question. Please.
Yes. Well, how can you comment on the fact that the sales of electric vehicles in Europe are actually increasing as a share of total sales of cars significantly? I think this year it was up to now 6% of car sales are electric vehicles. And share may be a better temporary insight into the future of the sector. Also, how can you comment on the fact that currently Tesla is the most valuable car company in the world? They are actually valuable more than half of car industry in Europe together. Thank you.
Well, the impact of this crisis on electric vehicles can go in two directions. On the one side, there are different discussion, we don't know the full impact of this crisis. On the one side, there is a possibility that the sales of electric vehicles will be significantly reduced due to lower GDP. However, the other side, as we have noticed before, the number of electric vehicles, we have especially high number of electric vehicles in the countries with higher GDP. And since the electric vehicles are more expensive than conventional cars, they will be preferred choice for the income group, higher income group. And they are maybe less affected by this crisis. So this can be the reason that in the short term, the impact on the electric vehicle market will be lower than on the total car sales. But there are also different situations. We will see the full impact at the end of this year. Regarding the Tesla, I'm not sure what is happening exactly now in the Tesla. I know that they have also at least temporarily closed the production due to the need for the important batteries from China. So this is something what have to be considered in the future. The whole car industry worldwide is very sensitive on the supply chain from China. And this is something what have to be considered for the future, to have more localized and more resilient supply chain for car industry.
Thank you.
Hvala. Thank you. I believe we have a question in Q&A. Professor Igor Vušanović asked, did you examine cases of London where they ban using vehicles in the city?
Yes. Yes, my question is because many of cities are banning the traffic in the downtown of the city. So how that affects on the mobility? Did you examine that?
This is a trend that has started also before this crisis. Many cities are trying to introduce these zero-emission zones to ban conventional cars. We have already started with the ban at first of diesel cars, which are seen as more polluted technologies. And through this introduction of zero-emission zones, we are increasing possibility for walking, cycling, and other more energy, let's say, less polluting transport modes. And this is something what will be for sure continued in the future. For example, in Vienna, we will this year have much more space in urban, city centers in first district. In this year, we will have much larger amount of zero-emission zones. So this is something what is happening in the most of the cities. We have increasing use of low carbon transport modes and and this can support also promote use of zero emission cars in the future.
If I can add, so for me, the key question is what we are going to do after the crisis is gone, after COVID is gone. Because if we're going to recover on the same level as before the COVID, we did nothing.
That's true. That's true. This is the reason that this crisis is really opportunity to rethink the whole system, to see what is the negative impact of the transport sector. And we have now possibility to see how we can do this in different way. We have learned how we can, for example, have this more flexible working patterns, and on this way reduce demand for mobility. So it's now really chance to make significant changes. However, it is very important to have political support, a political framework to do this in the future.
Frankly, I'm living in the very busy street, so I regret that COVID is still not yet here because I was enjoying for 3 months.
The most of us.
Without cars and without pollution, it was beautiful.
That was the only benefits of this crisis, but unfortunately short term. From the previous crisis, we have learned that usually after the crisis, we have this post-rebound effect, so increasing emissions. And it's very important to stop this, to make a change, to make this.
My point of view, long live COVID, until we go totally to electric or something else novel or sustainable. Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Varbanov is next. Could you turn on the microphone?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So my question was, I couldn't catch what kind of electric vehicles you considered. Is it just cars, or you also smaller electric vehicles like motorbikes and scooters?
Okay. Well, every type of electric vehicles could bring us advantages. Currently, I was talking about battery electric vehicles, passenger cars, while in Europe, passenger cars are responsible for about 61% of the total emissions from the road transport. So in this area, it's very important to do some changes. But electrification of all transport modes is very important. Private cars, this micro mobility, as well as public transport. It's also important to improve efficiency of conventional buses, public transport that we have. So electrification of all transport modes can bring us advantages.
Yeah, sure. I can give you an example with China. If you've been there recent years, you would understand me.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the small bikes are electrical, maybe 1 or 2 per thousand are with fuel. And it makes a huge difference. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
But the fact is that also in Europe, we have increasing use of e-mobility two-wheelers. So we have the e-bikes, we have scooters, electric scooters. So there is a lot of possibility for this share mobility to electric share mobility. They are also available in the most of the cities.
Okay. Dr. Pfeiffer, would you like to add something?
Oh, yes, thank you. So thank you very much for the interesting presentation, first of all. And you have shown that people have switched to personal vehicles instead of public transport to stick with social distancing. But how can public institutions use this time? Because hopefully it will not remain like this forever, and we will change the technology we use for transport in cities. Maybe this reduction in the number of all public transportation vehicles that are needed can be the time for public institutions to invest in cleaner electric buses. And also, for example, in air transport, which is reduced, maybe the chance is now to increase the quality and speed of trail transport between large cities in Europe. So to switch into the low carbon emission waste transport. And maybe also additional question regarding the electric vehicle batteries that can be connected to electrical grid and participate in some new business models. Could this boost the interest for electric vehicles after the crisis and secure development of the industry?
Well, yes, this is very important. So to have this sustainable development, to have this reduced emissions in the future, it's very important to have appropriate policy framework which support these transitions toward car-oriented mobility, towards other transport, more energy efficient transport mode, low carbon transport modes. However, currently, due to the lots of problems that we have due to this crisis, it can happen that mobility will not be the highest priority, and that would be the problem. So it's very important to ensure that in future we have really investment in this clean technology, so that these benefits that we have recognized now, we will have also in the future. This is very important. This is essential for the future to have this continuous sustainability development. We have already started this development towards more sustainable transport system, but this crisis is a chance to recognize how high priority is to have a good air quality in the cities. So as I said before, we have 3 million deaths due to the air pollution in cities, and this is something would have to be stopped. This is actually higher number than the total number of deaths due to the coronavirus. So it's time really to reconsider our transport system.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I believe Professor Kirkis now has a question about acceleration of behavior change. Please.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. Currently, when we are looking from a CO2 perspective, we see that the daily change in CO2 emissions from surface transport was about 7.5 million tons CO2 per day during the forced confinement. But at the same time, we see changes in transport systems limited still. Active mobility, as was mentioned in the presentation, avoided travel because of the flexibility of digital technologies. With ongoing increase in electric vehicles and zero emission zones in cities. So how can we accelerate the understanding that we need the combined effect of both infrastructure and behavioral change to address even the more serious crisis of climate change?
Unfortunately, now we have, from this crisis, we can recognize behavioral change, but unfortunately in wrong direction. Before the crisis, we have had a shift from private cars toward the public transport. And during this crisis, due to this risk of coronavirus, risk of infection, there was a shift from public transport towards the private cars. And this is something would have to be changed in the future. So it's very important to increase the quality of public transport, to reduce the risk of infection in the public transport so that we can avoid this car-oriented mobility. Due to this reduction of the total traffic, private car use over the time, we can notice that, for example, urban logistics was organized much better than it was case before. So this also provide of different transport services could be improved in the future.
Thank you. Professor Krajacic, I believe, has the next question on charging infrastructure. Please, Goran. Professor Krajacic has a problem with the microphone. His question was, do you have information on development of charging infrastructure in the last period?
The last period, this is the question, over the 2020, I don't have information, but the fact is that over the last years, there was investment in the charging infrastructure, especially in China. However, the most of the charging stations that we currently have, this public charging station, are slow charging station. And this is something what is pretty less attractive when we are using cars every day or actually for long distances. This longer charging time can be also seen as a disadvantage.
Thank you. May I ask you about hydrogen-powered vehicles? You didn't talk much about them, but they are kind of a competitor to battery electric vehicles, and some countries like Germany seem to be very in front of them. So what do you think about that?
Well, fuel cells cars are a special type of electric vehicles. They have also zero emissions at the point of use, and they are also very of interest. They have a longer driving range. They are already, regarding the driving range, competitive with conventional cars. But the problem in this case is that they have much higher investment cost. In this case, we need also completely new infrastructure to hydrogen production, delivery, refueling, and so on. So they have been seen as a long-term solution for the transport sector. So there are solutions that can be in use, let's say, starting from 2030, 2050, but not now. They are currently still too expensive in comparison to conventional cars. But they are for sure an option for the future. Actually, when we are comparing battery electric vehicles and fuel cells vehicles, battery electric vehicles have some advantages in the case that are used for the shorter driving range. But if we need longer driving range and larger cars, then we have much better performance with fuel cells vehicles.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the nice answers and for a really inspiring presentation, which shows that there is much to be done in the transport section for post-corona. I believe there is still a possibility to write the question in the conference system, because I see that there are many questions still. We have spent our hour. So thank you for a really very nice question. With this, I will conclude the invited lecture of Professor Amela Ajanovic. Thank you also to all participants, and we look forward to the next event. I believe in the next few days we will have a lot of very interesting lectures. Thank you and all the best. It's really a pity we couldn't meet in the beautiful city of Sarajevo, but next time I guess it will be better.
Hopefully next time.
When we beat Corona and we beat it sustainably, everything is going to be better, also the transport. Thank you all and see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.